Have you ever thought about like, okay, we have all this amazing technology and everything's changing so fast, but like, what if the biggest change is actually something way simpler? Something like, I don't know, a huge focus on quantity.
It is kind of wild when you think about it that way.
Right. It makes you look at like everything kind of differently.
What I find really interesting is, well, this idea that we're so obsessed with measuring and counting everything. Like, we think it means progress,
Yeah.
being all scientific and rational. But what if it's actually, like, the main thing shaping our world
Yeah.
in ways we don't even realize?
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually what we're going to really dive into today. We're doing a deep dive into the ideas of this guy, René Guénon.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of him.
He was a French thinker, really insightful back in the early to mid 20th century. And his book, The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times, he wrote it in 1945, but it's like this foundational critique of the modern world. And it's crazy how relevant it still feels today.
If you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, right? It's like Guénon was already seeing these trends almost 100 years ago,
Yeah.
and they've just gotten like way more intense since then. So his analysis is really useful, I think. It helps us understand not just the obvious changes, but the deeper stuff, the stuff that's kind of invisible but really shaping how we think and live.
And for our listeners who are always trying to, get to the heart of things quickly, this deep dive is kind of like a shortcut to understanding this, like, really fundamental critique of our time. We're going to break down Guénon's big idea, the reign of quantity, which is basically, well, it's this modern habit of reducing everything to what can be measured, to numbers, to statistics. It's like judging a painting only by how much paint the artist used.
Yeah. And that brings up a huge question, doesn't it? Like, why are we so fixated on quantity? Guénon's work, especially in Lord Northbourne's translation. Plus, there are some great editorial notes in there talking about how traditional values are disappearing. I mean, it really gets into the nitty-gritty of this. Guénon saw this whole focus on quantity as like a diagnosis, like a key symptom of some kind of modern sickness.
Totally. So what we're going to do today is our mission is pretty simple. We're going to really try to understand Guénon's concept of the reign of quantity. Like, what did he really mean by it? How did he see it playing out in the world? And maybe most importantly, what did he think the big implications were? From his own perspective, which is pretty unique. So where does he start? Like, how does he lay out this core idea?
Well, Guénon begins by saying that this tendency to like reduce everything to numbers, it's not just some small intellectual thing. He thinks it's a core trait of the entire modern mindset. And it's not just in science either, like how we try to understand nature. It's also in how we set up our societies, our social structures. It's everywhere.
So it's not just scientists using a lot of data. It's more like a cultural thing, a habit of seeing the world through numbers.
Right, exactly. And Guénon doesn't just pull this out of thin air. He says this emphasis on quantity lines up with, well, we're in this huge cosmic cycle, right? Humanity is. It's like the seasons. We're in a particular phase of this grand cycle.
Okay, cosmic cycle. That sounds kind of big. What does that mean exactly?
Well, he uses this Hindu concept of manvantara. It's like,
Hmm.
imagine a huge cosmic day. So Guénon's saying humanity is in this phase where we're slowly moving away from, he calls it the principle. It's like the original source of everything, like the ultimate unity of all existence. And this reign of quantity, he thinks, it's a big part of this descent.
Yeah.
We're heading towards what he considers like the lowest point of this cycle.
Okay, so it's not just a modern thing, this love of numbers. It's connected to this whole cosmic story of things moving away from their source, their origin. Now, to really understand reign of quantity, you have to know what it's being compared to, right? And that's where quality comes in.
Exactly. Guénon is really careful about this difference between quantitative and qualitative ways of seeing things. He points out that the traditional sciences, like think about geometry in the old days, it wasn't just about measuring shapes. It was about understanding their forms, their relationships. Or take numbers themselves. There was a whole deeper metaphysical understanding of what numbers meant. These sciences were all about quality. They were focused on the essence of things.
So, like, when ancient philosophers looked at geometry, they weren't just seeing lines and angles to measure.
Not really, no. In their core understanding, no. Guénon really emphasizes this. Geometric forms are the basis of symbols. Like from the letters we write to all these complicated spiritual diagrams and mandalas and stuff. These forms, they represent qualities, like the fundamental building blocks of reality. Not just dimensions you can measure, even numbers. In their original sense, these principial numbers, they represented qualities, archetypes, like the essential elements of existence itself.
So how is that different from how modern science works?
Well, Guénon says that modern science has pretty much abandoned this qualitative approach. They've traded it in for basic arithmetic, quantitative measurement. He uses Plato's allegory of the cave, which is a great analogy. He says modern thinkers are like the prisoners in the cave. They're obsessed with measuring the shadows on the wall, but they think the shadows are the real things. We're stuck on what we can count and measure, and we miss the deeper, essential qualities that those measurements are supposed to be about. And he says these original principial numbers are like totally opposite from the simple arithmetic we use every day.
That's a really good image. So this shift to quantity being more important, it started in the West, according to Guenon.
He's pretty clear about that, yeah. He says this modern way of thinking, this obsession with quantity, it came from the West. And now it's everywhere, obviously, globalized. But when it shows up in Eastern cultures, he sees it as Westernization. He argues that whoever you are, wherever you're from, if you take on this quantitative, materialist mindset, you get further away from the traditional Eastern spirit, which is, at its core, qualitative and metaphysical.
So when we talk about the world becoming more modern, we're basically talking about it becoming more Western in how it thinks about things.
Pretty much, yeah. And Guénon goes even further. He talks about a symbolic geography. He links the West's power, historically, to the end of a cycle. He points out that the West is where the sun sets, the end of its journey, symbolically. He compares it to the Chinese idea of the ripe fruit falling, which means like the culmination of a cycle, but also its decline.
And how did the West get so influential? How did it manage to spread its way of thinking all over the world?
Well, Guénon is pretty straightforward about this. He says it's mainly because of material power, brute force, basically. And he thinks this material power comes directly from the reign of quantity. So the West was able to impose its ideas because it was so good at the quantifiable stuff, which of course just reinforces the mentality he's critiquing.
Okay, so quantity leads to power, and power spreads the quantitative mindset. It's like a feedback loop. Now, what are some of the bad things that happen because of this focus on quantity? What does Guénon say are the consequences?
One big consequence he talks about is individualism. He thinks it's another defining feature of the modern mind. He connects it to the idea of the atom. Like in science, the atom is this basic, indivisible unit. He compares that to the isolated individual, the person who's supposed to be totally self-sufficient. He thinks both of these are treated like these endless, repeatable units. And he says that goes against the true nature of reality, which is all interconnected and qualitative.
So this idea of everyone being a separate, independent individual, it's tied to this idea of things being countable units.
Exactly. He brings it back to the cycle we talked about, the downward movement. He sees things going from an original unity to more and more fragmentation, more multiplicity. So these individuals, these units, they're part of that lower multiplicity. They've lost touch with the unifying principle. The overall trend, he says, is going from pure quality towards pure quantity. And he thinks both of those are extremes, actually. They lie outside of how things really are. One is like an ideal at the top, and the other is the bottom level.
That's a really different way of looking at individualism. What about modern science itself? How has this emphasis on quantity messed with fields like physics?
Guénon thinks that modern physicists, a lot of them, they make the mistake of mixing up quality and quantity. Like they're so focused on reducing qualities to amounts you can measure, they end up saying that matter itself has qualities, which leads to materialism. They're basically defining reality by what they can measure.
So the idea of matter that scientists use, Guénon says it's not the same as older ideas about matter.
No, he says it's different. He talks about this old concept, materia secunda. It means secondary matter, and it's defined as materia signata quantitate, which means matter that's marked by quantity. So in this traditional view, quantity is important to the physical world, yeah, but it's not the real essence of things. There's no quality in it, inherently. Rene uses this analogy of a building's foundation. He says the foundation is like quantity. It's necessary, but it's not the whole building. Materialism, he thinks, makes the mistake of thinking the foundation is everything.
That analogy actually makes it a lot clearer. So this whole quantity thing, it's even distorted how we understand what matter is at the most basic level. And Guénon also talks about how concepts themselves get, messed up. Degeneration of concepts, he calls it.
Right, yeah. He traces how big ideas have been changed and kind of cheapened by looking at everything through this quantitative lens. For example, he talks about how Descartes thought about matter, and he compares it to the older scholastic idea of materia secunda. Guenon thinks that Descartes' concept of matter kind of paved the way for how modern physics sees it, but it already had this shift built in. It was already moving away from quantity being the main thing.
How so?
Guenon says that Descartes brought in this idea of extension, that matter takes up space. That's its main attribute. And while, yeah, you can measure extension, it's not just pure quantity. It has this spatial aspect, which is more than just a number. He also talks about atomistic theories, the ones that say matter is made of tiny, discrete units, like little bits of quantity. And he points out that those units still have to take up space, right? So they have extension. He says there's a mix-up, a confusion between body, which is a real form with qualities, and materia secunda, which is more like the underlying principle. It doesn't have qualities in itself.
And what are the concept of number? Does that get messed up too?
Guénon thinks so. He sees numbers like the most basic way we talk about quantity, things like extension and how long something lasts, duration. Those come from number, he says. But then he says that even though we tend to think we can measure everything with numbers, even space and time, it's hard to fully reduce them to just quantities. He thinks modern science, in its, obsession with measuring everything, often ends up with what he calls empty notions, ideas that don't have real meaning because they ignore the qualitative side of things.
Empty notions, huh? That's a
Yeah,
pretty harsh thing to say. And what about the idea of measure? He thinks we've gotten that wrong too.
definitely. Guenon says the traditional meaning of measure is totally different from how modern science sees it. In the old days, measure was connected to creation itself, manifestation. It was like a quality built into every level of existence. He uses this image of light rays coming from a central point, and the rays define space and how far they reach. That's the measure of that space. It's very different from just using a ruler to compare things, which is how modern science sees it.
So traditionally, measure had a more, I don't know, a richer meaning, like a spiritual meaning almost, connected to how reality unfolds. And now he gets into spatial quantity, this idea of qualified space. What's the main point he's making?
He's saying that extension, which is what we usually associate with
Yep.
space, it's not just about quantity. If space was only quantity, it would be totally uniform, right? Every part would be the same except for size. And he says that's just an abstract idea. It's like an empty box with nothing in it. It couldn't exist in the real world.
So because things exist within space, that gives space certain qualities.
Right. Just by being there, things make space different qualitatively. But Guénon goes even further. He says that even geometrically qualified space is the real thing. He describes it as space that's defined by directions that come out from a central point. And that center, and those lines going outwards, that's the basis for the symbolism of the three-dimensional cross, in a lot of traditions.
So this idea of directions and a central point, what does that mean symbolically?
He thinks that if we focus more on spatial directions again, it could help us understand the real meaning of geometry. He thinks these ideas were really important to traditional societies and how they saw the cosmos.
So it's like space isn't just this blank slate, it has a structure to it and qualities tied to a central point and the directions coming from it. What about time, though? Is that qualified too?
Yeah, for sure. He says time isn't just a straight line, like modern math makes it out to be. He thinks that's way too simple. The traditional view of time is cyclical, he says, and cycles mean that time isn't uniform. It has different phases, characteristics, each with its own nature.
So, like,
Yeah.
not every moment in time is the same.
Exactly. And just like with space, we use metaphors about space to talk about time, which means they're really connected, qualitatively. And he describes this cyclical movement of time as like a gradual movement away from the principle. But then as we get closer to the end of the cycle, things speed up. Like an object falling, it accelerates.
And that does feel kind of true today, right? Like things are moving faster and faster. So, Guénon also talks about uniformity and how the modern world wants to make everything the same. What's his problem with that?
He sees this modern need to make everything uniform for people and things as a really bad thing. He thinks it creates this artificial world, a world obsessed with things that can be standardized and measured, and the practical applications of all this quantitative science, like industry, mass production, that becomes all about quantity too. Quality gets sacrificed, both in how things are made and in the final product.
So mass-produced, identical stuff for interchangeable people, that's the ultimate result of this focus on quantity and uniformity.
Exactly. And he points to architecture too. These massive uniform buildings designed to make everyone's living space the same, which is the opposite of traditional building practices, where things were guided by rituals, symbolic meaning. He sees all this progress we've made with industry as actually a decline, a pretty serious one that's getting worse fast.
That's a pretty dark view. So he also asked this question: has the environment itself changed in a way that, like, mirrors this focus on quantity? What does he think about that?
He suggests that, yeah, maybe the environment has actually gotten worse,
Mhm.
qualitatively, which makes it easier for quantity to take over.
Yeah.
And he says the artificial changes we make are actually a result of deeper natural changes that are happening because of how the cosmic order and human society are linked within the cycle of time.
So it's not just us messing with nature. Nature itself might be changing in a way that makes quantity more powerful.
That's what he's suggesting, yeah. And this shift towards quantity, it's really affected how we see traditional arts and crafts, too.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Guénon talks about how modern society, which is all about usefulness and making money, it sees art and crafts as like luxury items. They lose their connection to anything deeper, any principles. He really emphasizes this traditional view that everything humans do,
Yeah.
science, art, craft, should be rooted in these principles. He even quotes this Latin phrase, ars sine scientia nihil, art without knowledge is nothing. That's how medieval artisans saw it.
And being connected to these principles, Guénon says, it changes the activity itself. It's
Yeah.
not just a job anymore. It's like being part of a bigger tradition. It becomes almost sacred, ritualistic. He even says that in these kinds of societies, every job is a priesthood. Though he's careful to say you shouldn't take that literally.
It's like a totally different way of thinking about work. It's not just about getting a result, it's about connecting to something bigger. And how does that compare to how we see religion today
Yeah.
in the modern world?
Well, in traditional societies, Guénon explains this religion, or whatever their traditional system of sacred laws and knowledge is. It's woven into everything. It's not this separate thing like it often is in the West. He also mentions how, in some traditional cultures, certain crafts have initiations, to get deeper into the craft. And he says that shows their qualitative nature, how they're paths to spiritual understanding.
So creating something skillfully with intention could be like a spiritual practice in itself.
Exactly. And he makes this distinction between a tool and a machine. What do you think is the big difference there from his perspective?
Well, a tool is more like an extension of the person, right? It takes skill, you put your intention into it, and there's a connection between the craftsperson and the object. A machine is more like the machine does the work, the person just operates it, doing the same motions over and over.
Yeah, that's right. He famously said, the machine kills the craft.
It takes the humanity out of the work. It turns the worker into just another part of the machine. And that leads us to his whole critique of the modern industrial world.
Guénon says that modern industry is like the ultimate victory of quantity and uniformity. It churns out the same things over and over for people who seem the same. And it's all about making as much as possible. He even talks about how modern living spaces are designed, like standardized units, to get rid of any differences in quality. It's the opposite of traditional architecture, which was all about ritual and symbols. He sees modern progress through industrialization as a huge decline.
A world where everyone and everything is the same. Now, what about this idea of being anonymous in your work? He talks about that too, doesn't he?
Yeah, he compares being anonymous in traditional craft work to being anonymous in a factory job. In traditional crafts, being anonymous could be a good thing, a sign of humility. You're putting the craft first, not your own ego. It's part of this bigger order, maybe even a cosmic order.
So it's about putting the work above getting credit for it.
Right. But in a factory, it's different. The worker is just a number in this big mechanical system. They can be easily replaced, and their work doesn't have any personal expression in it. Guénon says that this mechanical way of working is, like, subhuman. It's all about quantity.
So one kind of anonymity is like a spiritual discipline, and the other is just dehumanizing. Now, he also goes after this idea of perfect repetition, that things can be exactly the same. What's his argument against that?
He challenges this whole idea of absolute repetition, what philosophers call idem per idem, or indiscernibles, including that saying, the same causes always produce the same effects. He says that in reality, the exact same causes and effects can never happen, because things are always different in subtle ways, even if we don't see those differences right away. He even questions the idea that history repeats itself. He says we only see things that are similar, not exact copies.
Because time and place are always different, so they create unique qualities that prevent things from being truly identical.
Exactly. He emphasizes that real space and time, they aren't just these neutral containers. They have their own qualities, which affect what happens. He says that only math, pure math, can be an exact science, because it only deals with abstract quantities. The rest of modern science, he thinks, is just making rough guesses about a reality that's much more complicated.
So even the idea of science being super precise,
Mm-hmm.
Guénon says it's based on this shaky foundation. And he's also critical of this idea of primitive simplicity, isn't he? Some people today think we should go back to that. What's his take on that?
He thinks it's nonsense, basically. He argues against this idea that we should go back to a primitive simplicity, like some modern reformers want. He says it never really existed the way they imagine it, and he thinks it's often just a way for them to justify their own new ideas, or a delusion they have. He also points out it doesn't really make sense with their belief in progress, right?
Why does he think true primitive simplicity is a myth?
He says at the very beginning of anything, it has to be super complex because the first seed, the germ of whatever it is, it has to contain everything that it will become. All the possibilities are already there, so it's not simple at all. He says that primitive simplicity could only apply to chaos, which is like the basic stuff of the universe,
Yeah.
before things take form. But we can never really go back to that, and it wouldn't be good for human society anyway.
So chaos is the only real simplicity, but it's before anything exists, really, not something we should aim for. Now, Guénon talks about materialism itself, like what it really is. How does he define that?
He says that materialism is like a fake principle, a pseudo-principle, that's connected to the world becoming more material, more solidified, as he calls it. And this happens as the cycle goes downward. He says that the modern idea of matter as this purely quantitative stuff, totally inert, with no qualities or life in it, it's an illusion. He says that a world that was truly inert would just stop existing. Materialization is like a trend, a direction things are going, not a state that can actually be reached.
So matter isn't really just dead and passive like materialists think.
Nope. And because of that, he says that the laws of physics, the mechanical laws, they're all just approximations. They can't perfectly predict things because they don't account for everything that's really going on.
They're oversimplified, they don't capture the real complexity. So then he talks about how the world is solidifying and how materialism makes this worse. What does he mean by solidification?
By solidification, he means how the quantitative, the material, is becoming more and more dominant. He thinks that materialism actually makes this process worse. Because if you're a materialist, you can't see certain aspects of reality. The qualitative stuff, the subtle stuff, it becomes invisible. It's like you're blind to anything that can't be measured.
So by believing in materialism, we kind of make the world more materialistic.
In a way, yeah. But he says this solidification can never be complete, and it actually gets more unstable as it progresses. All the fast changes we're seeing, the acceleration of everything, he thinks that's evidence that this materialistic system is unstable. He even says there are cracks appearing, fissures in this seemingly closed system. And he thinks these cracks might be letting in lower, more chaotic forces as the cycle gets closer to its end. And even the idea of matter in modern physics, it seems to be dissolving, which he thinks could be a step towards the final dissolution of this whole cycle.
It's like the harder we try to hold on to this idea of solid, quantifiable matter, the more it slips away from us. Now, he also talks about language and money being corrupted. How does that fit in with the reign of quantity?
He gives examples of how language has become more and more about quantity. It's losing its ability to express deeper, more subtle meanings. And with money, he says it's lost any real value, any connection to a higher order. Money is just numbers now, and it's constantly losing its worth. He thinks this could lead to a collapse of the whole system, which shows how fragile society is if it's only based on quantities. He contrasts modern money, which is just numbers, with old coins. You know how they used to have symbols on them representing spiritual authority.
So even language and money, these basic points of life, they reflect this shift towards quantity and its instability. And he goes back to this idea of the environment changing, saying that it's not just about the changes we make ourselves.
Right? He says it again. There are changes happening that we don't control, deeper changes connected to the solidification of the world and our own materialist attitudes.
Shifts that we might not even notice. Now, Guenon, he's smart. He knows someone might say, well, if the world is changing in these qualitative ways, shouldn't we see that in archaeology? What does he say about that?
He says, well, all the archaeological evidence has also been subject to this solidification. It's part of the same process. And he also says that historians, most of them have this modern secular worldview. And because of that, they hit these walls, these barriers in time, things they just can't seem to understand, like the 6th century BCE, for example, or the traditional date for the start of the Kali Yuga in Hindu cosmology. He points out that it's really hard to make exact timelines and to really understand civilizations from way back in the past. And it's interesting, he says that the oldest stuff we found, it roughly matches up with when the Kali Yuga is supposed to have started.
So our ability to understand the past is limited by our modern mindset, which is all about quantity. Now he gets into symbolism, talking about circles and squares. What do they represent?
He explains that, traditionally, a sphere or a circle, those represent heaven. They're symbols of essence, the unmanifested principle. While a cube or a square represents the earth, substance, the manifested world. These are like fundamental archetypes. He also mentions that the tools used to draw these shapes, the compass and the square, they have the same symbolic meaning in both Eastern and Western traditions.
So basic shapes are really symbolic. They point to these big cosmic principles. How does this symbolism connect to the terrestrial paradise and the heavenly Jerusalem?
Those two, he says, they're like the endpoints of the current cycle. The terrestrial paradise at the beginning is symbolized by a circle, while the heavenly Jerusalem at the end is symbolized by a square. So this change from a circle to a square, it represents how the cycle fulfills all its possibilities. It's like a crystallization, going from a garden, which is more fluid, to a city, which is more structured and solid. He even talks about squaring the circle, which you can't actually do mathematically. But symbolically, it represents the completion of the cycle.
So solidification has two meanings then. It's bad in the sense that it's about descending into just quantity, but it's also necessary for the cycle to end.
Exactly. And Guénon says that for the cycle to truly end, and for things to be restored to their original state, there has to be an intervention. Something from beyond this cycle has to step in. That's what leads to the new heaven and new earth, and the next cycle begins.
It's like a cyclical view of history, but with a spiritual solution. And he brings in Cain and Abel from the Bible. What do they represent in terms of settling down versus living a nomadic life?
Cain, the farmer, he represents people who settle down. Abel, the shepherd, represents nomadic people. Guénon says they're like primordial types of humans, with different traditions and ways of doing rituals. He points out that the Hebrew Torah comes from a nomadic tradition, which affects how the story of Cain and Abel is told. He also says that this idea of dual symbolism applies here, like one symbol can have two opposite meanings, and it's connected to the symbolism of Cain killing Abel. In the Hebrew tradition, they originally didn't like settled stuff, like building permanent houses and things.
So it's not just an old story. It's about these fundamental archetypes, different ways of being in the world with spiritual implications. What about metalworking? He talks about that too.
Yeah, he talks about how in traditional societies, metallurgy was seen as both sacred and as error, potentially dangerous. It was linked to the planets and stars and to the fire under the earth. If you used metallurgy in rituals, it could lead to spiritual transformation. But using it in a profane way could unleash negative forces. That's why blacksmiths and metalworkers were often seen as having special kind of ambiguous status. Sometimes they were respected for their skills, but sometimes people were suspicious of them.
Another example of how there's this deeper, qualitative side to things that seem purely material. Now, Guénon gets into space-time, those modern physics theories. What does he think about those?
Well, he says that a lot of people misunderstand space-time. They think it means time is just a fourth dimension, like space, which isn't really accurate. He explains that while mathematicians use imaginary time as a fourth coordinate in their equations, what that means is that time has to become like space, imaginary, for it to fit in. He says that this merging of time and space, where time becomes completely like space, it can only really happen at the end of the world, symbolically speaking.
So time and space are fundamentally different, and when they start to blend together, it means the cycle is ending. And that end, he says, is intemporal. What does that mean?
It means it's outside of time, how we normally understand it. Both the end of the cycle and the beginning, they exist outside of time. The end is a return to the primordial state. He says that the heavenly Jerusalem and the terrestrial paradise are like outward expressions of the center of the world. And this center is hidden during the cycle. That's what's called the fall. Moving away from the center is like going from essence to substance, from unity to multiplicity.
This center of the world sounds like a big deal in his thinking.
Oh, it is. Guénon explains that in Sanskrit, the word for paradise, pardes, it actually means two things. It means both supreme region and distant region. So it's both far away and the highest. Which sounds contradictory, but it shows that paradise, the center of all things, it might seem far off, but it's also always the closest thing to us. But to realize that, to see that closeness, we have to go beyond our normal way of experiencing time. For all of humanity to be free from time means finishing the cycle of physical existence and returning to the primordial state, to the center of the world.
Like going back to the source after this long journey through the cycle. Now, Guénon talks about how everything's speeding up today, right? Events are happening faster and more intensely. What's his interpretation of that?
He thinks it means we've passed the point of greatest solidity, how things seemed more stable in the past. He thinks the world is heading towards dissolution now, this feeling that everything's unstable.